AP5 student, that's okay. We're going to cover basically what we covered 6 weeks in AP Biology in a period here to give you just a good idea about Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and ultimately, how does it connect to the idea of survival, which is the course you're interested in. If something pops in your mind, toss your hand up and I'm happy to answer your question.
There are no stupid questions because this is confusing stuff. We had some really good questions last year that people were a little nervous to ask in the middle of the presentation, and then I asked them later and they ended up being really good questions. So just ask. We won't laugh. I won't laugh.
You're good whenever.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so before we start with the presentation, just a little bit about my background. I've been a biology teacher here for the last 14 school years, and my undergraduate degree is in biology from Lebanon Valley College, and I had a focus on evolutionary biology in that program. And I'm currently finishing up a master's program in biology through Hudson University, and that program started with a focus on evolution. So this is a topic that I know quite a bit about. I hope to share some of the interesting things I know about evolution with you today. If there are questions you have that I'm not able to answer, though, I will happily look up some information and get back to you. I know where you are at third period, so I'll be able to get that information to you. So today we're talking about survival and Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And before we go to lunch, I just want to talk a little bit about Charles Darwin's background, a little bit about why he was interested in science, why he was interested in nature, and how he started to get some background information together to present his theory of evolution, which you've read a little bit about in excerpts from the Origin of Species book, right? A chance to read a couple of excerpts. So here's a famous picture of Charles Darwin. Of course, typically when we see him portrayed in media, he's got this big bushy beard, he's an old, wise-looking guy. Of course, Charles Darwin didn't always look like that. In fact, when he did most of his research and his data collection, he was quite a young man, in his early to mid-20s. And the interesting thing about that is for much of scientific discovery, especially in modern scientific discovery, our labs are filled with people who are college and graduate students in their 20s. So much scientific discovery is being done by people just a little bit older than you. And if you are going into the sciences, I hope you take advantage of lab opportunities at your colleges because you might have a chance to be a part of the next discovery of a medicine or a treatment or one of these great theories like Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. So Charles Darwin was born in 1809 in England. And the reason I tell you that, not that it's important to memorize what day he was born, it's just to kind of set the stage for the time period where he was developing his theory. Early 1800s England. If you were to walk down the streets of London and pick a random person, a student, a doctor, a scientist, a member of the church, clergy, and ask them, why do we have so many different types of life here on Earth, what would their universal answer have been? Right? God, they were made that way. That's the way living things are created. That's just the way living things are. Charles Darwin, over the course of his life, presents a theory for why we have different types of life on Earth that doesn't say that they've always been this way. They've actually been changing over time. And he presents a lot of evidence based on data he collected, specimens he collected over a lot of years, a lot of countries, a lot of continents, to support that theory. So I'm not here today to challenge your religious beliefs, but I'm not going to talk about them at all. I'm going to talk about the scientific community's explanation for why we have different types of life. And not only why we have those types of life, but why they've been able to survive. What is it that has allowed us as humans to still be here on Earth, even though Earth is always changing? In fact, recently it's been dramatically changing with climate change. Are we as humans threatened in the future? Do we have to continue to change in order to survive? We'll kind of get into that today. So, as a kid, Charles Darwin was super interested in nature. I like to call him a naturalist. If he had some free time, he would spend that time in a stream, picking up rocks and looking for insects. He would be in fields, collecting specimens. He would go to woods and kind of count the trees and figure out, why does this woods have more oak trees? Why does this woods have more pine trees? He was just super interested in nature. Now, his dad didn't want him to be a scientist or a naturalist. His dad determined that he was going to be a surgeon. So his dad forces him to go to the University of Edinburgh. While there, Charles Darwin spends his time basically memorizing human anatomy, studying medicine, studying surgery, and then eventually he has to spend long hours observing surgery. Now, we live close enough to Gettysburg that I believe you've heard stories of what surgery was like in the 1800s, right? How would you describe surgery in that time period? What are some descriptive words you might use or some images? Scary? What's that?
Brutal.
Brutal? What kind of things did we do during surgery in the 1800s?
Cut off the limbs.
Right, you have a problem with your arm, we don't go in and rebuild the bone like we do now, or cut out cancer tissue, we just cut the arm off. So there was lots of gore, lots of blood. Charles Darwin hated that. Hated it so much, in fact, that his grades were suffering and he wasn't doing very well. So his dad pulls him out of medical school and sends him to Christ College. And at Christ College, his dad wanted him to study to become a member of the clergy. Well, Charles Darwin also disliked this. Some reports are that he disliked this even more than he liked medical school, but he sticks with it, he finishes that degree, and then Charles Darwin goes out to try to find a job that matches his interests. Remember, I said he was a naturalist. He loved studying nature. And so Charles Darwin sees an ad for someone to ride along on a ship that's going to travel across the southern hemisphere for about 5 years. And this person's job would be to, every time they land at a port, to explore the natural world, to collect specimens, to take notes, to document. This is the perfect job for Darwin. He's been preparing for this for his whole life. So Darwin applies for this job. He has to do some convincing to his dad and to the ship's captain. Eventually he convinces them, he gets the job. Charles Darwin is going to spend the next 5 years after his time at Christ College traveling all around the southern hemisphere. So if we take a look at this map, first he starts up here in England, and he's going to travel through South America first. He actually spends more time on land than on the ship. So this picture focuses on the ship part of his trip. But imagine at each of those ports he spends months, some weeks, sometimes months at a time on land. West coast of Africa, the east coast of South America, west coast of South America. He stops at a place called the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are super important in his development of the theory of evolution. The Galapagos Islands are cool in that they're far enough away from the mainland that animals don't travel back and forth very often, but animals could potentially travel back and forth. So he has this essentially a real-life petri dish, where he can observe living things that have been living in isolation for thousands of generations, and he can kind of start to see some patterns. He notices that there are some birds that look identical. He's got a bunch of birds on this island that look like they might be the same species, but they have some distinct differences in their face. Some of them have long, pointy beaks. Some of them have short, strong beaks. And he notices that the type of beak they have correlates to the type of food available in the part of the island where they live. He wants to know why is that the case? What would be an explanation for their beaks matching the food that's available? He continues to see similar things in New Zealand, in Australia, in the southern part of Africa, and eventually, after 5 years on the ship and on land, he arrives back in England with lots of trunks full of notes. He filled many journals with his observations. He's got trunks full of specimens, little bottles full of insects. He's got fossils, he's got skeletons, and Darwin spends the next several decades just going through his specimens, talking with other scientists, trying to think through, how can I explain why I saw these trends in the natural world? Why do living things seem to change over time? Why do they seem to be a good fit for the environment they live in? So later in Darwin's life, he's put his ideas together, he starts writing a manuscript, he's going to publish a book sharing his theory of evolution, and he hears that someone else in England is presenting a similar idea at a lecture. So he goes and meets this guy and he figures out, wow, this guy has the same basic explanation for evolution that I have. Better get my work published. So Darwin publishes his book on the origin of species in 1859. And this book is revolutionary. Revolutionary because it changes the minds of people who read the book. The scientific community very quickly is convinced by Charles Darwin's arguments that, yeah, evolution does happen here on Earth. We do see species change over time, and as they're changing, they seem to become a better fit for their environment. Revolutionary in that not only did he convince people in London, he convinced scientists worldwide, and to this day, in 2020, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is the foundation of biology. Much of what we understand about the natural world is predicated upon what he writes in his book, Origin of Species. So I think we will stop there, and then after lunch, we're going to jump into the two main ideas from the book, and I've got lots of stories, pictures, videos, simulations, and how to help you understand those concepts that Charles Darwin talks about. And then I'll tell you, we're going to end the class period today by looking at the future of your evolution, how we as humans might change in the future to deal with something as dramatic as a car crash. Could we eventually have a human body that survives car crashes really easily? We'll get to that in a minute here. All right. So, do you want them to wait for the bell, or since we're far away?
And I don't even remember.
She was so
I was gonna ring that bell. But then I second guessed myself.
Why is she so angry? That's what I want to know. Why was she so mad?
It probably says Star Wars.
I guess it's not here. My favorite.
Started.
Like, I was curious if
Just
she
calculated.
right. She was so angry. She was so angry.
Oh, this is 1960s.
Stop putting back my phone.
Counted my cards.
Yeah.
Come on, I gotta see There's 3 more days. I didn't get
You know
20.
what? We might need to hit record on the video.
One piece right now.
Emily just walked about, no, she just recorded.
Maybe it's recording. It's good? All right, cool. You can edit that part out. All right, so let's jump into the main points of the book, Origin of Species, or Only Origin of Species. I've divided the book into 2 major points here. And we're going to take a look at each one, take a look at some examples, and see if we can make sense of this. So the first major point in Charles Darwin's book is that evolution occurs. Just a statement that, yeah, living things change. We don't think that life on Earth is exactly as it was hundreds or even thousands of years ago. We think it's been changing over time. So in other words, organisms change over time, and life on Earth has changed as descendants diverged from common ancestors in the past. Now, if he's going to say that living things have changed and evolved, he's going to have some evidence for it. And so, fortunately for Darwin, he's got those 5 years of experience of the HMS Beagle to draw from. He's got fossil records that show that living things seem to show a pattern of change. Of course, he doesn't have DNA evidence yet. That doesn't come for over 100 years. But he is able to tell a story based on the fossil record and based on these trends and observations that he noticed. I'm going to show you a couple examples here. These aren't necessarily ones that he talks about in the book, but they're really well represented in graphics, so I thought they'd make good examples. Let's start with the elephant. So how many species of elephant are living on Earth today?
6.
6 is a bit too many. Yeah, it's 2. There are 2 species. One that's found in Africa and one species that's found in Asia. And we creatively call them the African elephant and the Asian elephant. So those elephants are descendants of some past elephant species that looked very different. If we go back just one level of evolution, one big change ago, elephants didn't look like our current elephants, they looked like Manny from Ice Age, woolly mammoths. And we know that woolly mammoths existed because we have their bodies. We're not dependent on fossil records, we're not depending on a guess. We actually have carcasses from these woolly mammoths that have been frozen in ice, and then recently, as ice is melting, we've been able to find these bodies and study them. In fact, they're so well preserved that we have access to woolly mammoth DNA that was trapped in their cells when the mammoths were frozen. We think we have the whole genome, the whole collection of genes for a woolly mammoth. So there are scientists who are working right now in labs across the world at bringing the woolly mammoths back. Basically, it's going to seem like Jurassic Park. Familiar with what they did in Jurassic Park? They took old dinosaur DNA, they injected it into an egg, they let the egg grow, and there was a baby dinosaur. A similar idea. They're trying to take modern elephants, remove the chromosomes and the genes from their eggs, insert the woolly mammoth DNA, reimplant that egg, and see will a baby woolly mammoth develop, will it be born, will it grow up. There's a high bit of confidence that they will be able to do this, although they haven't been able to do it yet. So here's a visual of this. Starting on the right, there's the modern African elephant. We go back, there is an extinct earlier version of the elephant, the mammoth. And as we keep going back in the fossil record, we see that these elephants were changing over time. Why were they changing? Well, they were dealing with different environmental pressures. Nature was changing, so they were changing to survive. If we go way back in the fossil record, we see that the ancestors to the common elephant was no bigger than between a dog and a cow, about that size. Here's an outline of a human, so you can see that was a pretty small organism. Now, elephants are my favorite animal, but my son's favorite animal is the dinosaur. He loves T-Rex. And there were a couple times when he was a little smaller that he asked Santa for a T-Rex for Christmas. And so we told him, T-Rexes are extinct, bud. You're never going to have a pet T-Rex. However, before the T-Rex went extinct, it did branch off into some other species that then descended and were able to survive the Great Extinction. You know what the closest, some of you that have my class will know this, what is the closest living relative on Earth to the T-Rex? Chicken, right? The chicken. Mrs. Lumen's familiar with chickens. Little T-Rexes running around.
We lost one last.
Oh no.
Yeah, so just died.
Was it natural causes?
We think she was egg bound.
Okay.
They
Oh,
took
yeah.
her egg out and therefore it died.
Thought of your chickens. There's some.
Maybe just get it.
This is fox mating season.
I mean, if you feel comfortable fingering a chicken like in that way, I guess I feel like that's
It's like we're dead.
not something I would do. Maybe we cut that part out.
That'd be really good. Send me a copy. So, anyways, these modern chickens have in their DNA remnants of T-Rex DNA. Now, we don't have a whole collection of T-Rex DNA like we do for woolly mammoths, so we can't bring back a whole T-Rex. But what we might be able to do is take a modern chicken, activate some of its T-Rex genes, pass those genes to the next generation, and maybe have a chick that hatches with some T-Rex characteristics. Maybe the wings reform back into those little front legs, maybe the mouth and the teeth redevelop, maybe the tail redevelops. And so the project's called Chickosaurus. They're looking at, can we have a chicken with activated T-Rex genes? The reason we can do that is because of the fact that living modern chickens are modified descendants of dinosaurs. Even though the dinosaurs have gone extinct, they have descendants that survived and were able to adapt to the changing world. All right. So part one, pretty easy to understand. Living things change. We can see evidence that living things have changed. Part two is going to be the mechanism that Darwin uses to explain how evolution happens. And this is the concept of natural selection. He says, natural selection, how evolution occurs, natural selection is a process in which living things with beneficial traits produce more offspring than others do. So if we're talking about a species and there are some members of that species that have the traits that make them a better fit for their environment, they're going to be able to survive, and if you survive, you get to reproduce. If you get to reproduce, you get to make the next generation of the species look a little bit more like you. So I think the easiest way to understand this is by watching a simulation. We're going to watch a rabbit mating simulation, and if you didn't have an evolution lesson on natural selection in any of your previous classes, you have a good understanding of natural selection after you watch this simulation. All right, here we go. So we're going to run the simulation a few times and make some changes in each round. For this first round, we are going to just have one single rabbit. I notice that rabbit has white fur. I notice the background is brown. Maybe it's dead grasses, maybe it's mud, maybe it's dirt, right? And this rabbit doesn't seem to be a good fit for this environment. Why? That's meant to be an easy question. It's not a trick question. Why is it not a good fit?
White.
It's white, so
Does it blend in?
doesn't blend in, right? It's not well camouflaged. And so if a predator happens to come in through this environment, that rabbit's going to get eaten. Although this rabbit died of loneliness, we didn't have a mate for it, and it just died out. So let's run the simulation again, and we're going to give this rabbit a friend. So we've got these two rabbits, they're going to mate, and we're going to see this population start to grow. Yeah, they're busy. So if there are no predators introduced into this ecosystem, it doesn't matter if they're white. It doesn't matter if they're not a good fit for the environment, because there's not an environmental pressure that's trying to kill them. They can just grow and grow and grow, and natural selection really isn't playing a role right now. In fact, if we just kind of let this simulation run, eventually they're going to overpopulate this ecosystem, and we can even imagine that if we were to give them enough time, enough rounds of reproduction, they just might take over the entire world. Ooh. All right, so that's not a realistic simulation. Let's run this again, and this time we're going to introduce predators. Give the rabbit a friend. We'll let them go through a round or two of reproduction, and then we're going to bring in a pack of wolves. All right, so here come the wolves. These rabbits are not a good fit for this environment. Oh my goodness, we got a bunny buffet, right? There's just a bunny massacre here because they don't blend in very well. You told me they weren't a good fit for this environment because they're not camouflaged, so it was really easy for the wolves to eat them. So this isn't natural selection yet. There's really no benefit. One rabbit doesn't have a benefit over the other. Some aren't surviving because of any traits that they have. And so the rabbits are going to become extinct. So in our final run of the simulation, we're going to introduce the idea of natural selection. So we've got our 2 white rabbits. And then before we introduce the wolves, we are going to introduce a random mutation into the fur collar. And so by chance, the genes passed from one generation to the next might have mutated enough that the fur produces some brown pigment. And now we have some genetic variety in this population. We have the possibility that some rabbits are a better fit for their environment than others, which means they're more likely to survive, which means they're more likely to reproduce, and now we'll start to see some evolution happening. So let's bring in the wolves. Are they eating some brown rabbits? Sure, right? But more likely, they're eating the easy-to-see white rabbits, and so we would say these brown rabbits are a better fit for their environment, and over time, this population of rabbits will start to look more and more like those brown rabbits, because more brown rabbits are surviving and reproducing. Now that doesn't mean brown is best at all times in all places. Because check this out, see how the population is becoming more brown? If nature changes, if this environment becomes, a predominantly snowy environment, so we'll switch to the Arctic, all of a sudden the tables have turned. Now those white rabbits are a better fit for their environment, and they're camouflaged. So we would expect to see, over time, this population begin to evolve again. Begin to change to look more like the white rabbits that blend in, and less like the brown rabbits which stand out. If you can understand that pretty easy simulation, you understand Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Things that change in nature ultimately determine which organisms live, reproduce, and future generations look like the organisms that survive. All right. So let's go back to those finches, those birds we were talking about earlier on the Galapagos Islands. So Darwin noticed that in some parts of the island, we have these birds that have these really sharp, pointy beaks. And he also noticed that that's the part of the island where birds were predominantly eating insects. So here's how the theory of natural selection, or theory of evolution by natural selection goes. At one point, a group of birds arrived on this island, and all of these birds were members of the same species, so they looked the same. They had the same beak. But as they spread out on this island, they encountered different food sources. So birds that settled in the part of the island that had lots of insects available, any baby birds born with a slightly sharper beak had an advantage. They were a better fit for the environment because they could dig into wood, they could dig for the insects, they'd get a meal. If they got good meals, they survived, they reproduced, and they made future generations look like them. On another part of the island, you have birds that eat buds and fruit. Notice that beak shape is very different. It helps them to chew up the flesh of fruit. Over many generations, not only did the species start to look different, the birds of the species start to look different, eventually they became different species. In fact, if you go to the Galapagos Islands and you DNA test those birds, they are very closely related. We believe they were all the same species at one point. But if you take a bird from one side of the island and a bird from the other side of the island and try to breed them, they won't mate. They don't recognize each other as members of the same species because they've gone through so much change, so much evolution. Even though they've been surviving, they've been doing what they need to do, survive in their parts of the island, they've experienced so much change that they've actually split into different types of life. Now, to fully understand how evolution and survival are related, we got to talk about variation, genetic variation. In our first rabbit simulation, where all the rabbits were white and there's no variation, as soon as the wolves arrived, all rabbits were equally susceptible to being eaten by a wolf, and we wiped out the population really quickly. Well, that same kind of thing has happened in real life, and I'm going to tell you a story about bananas that are a great example of how variation plays a role in survival or extinction. So let's start by asking, how many of you are banana fans? Anybody like to eat bananas? Oh wow, that's most all day. Like 2 people here. Wow. I'm not a banana fan. I'm a banana eater. I don't like bananas, but I know that some of you really enjoy them. If you were to go back in time, to like the 1950s, and go to a local supermarket to buy some bananas, you would not find the type of bananas that we have today. They weren't really being grown commercially. They weren't being shipped around the world. Instead, you find this. This is a species of banana called the Gros Michel banana. It's kind of a fun name, Gros Michel. And the Gros Michel banana was a species of banana that had fruit that was a little bit short and stubby, a little bit thicker, and its flavor was substantially sweeter than our modern bananas, our current bananas. In fact, if you wonder what these bananas taste like, eat a piece of candy that's banana flavored. Banana yogurt, banana baby food, banana gum, all of those foods use a flavoring that was invented using the flavor of the Gros Michel banana. So these bananas were shipped all over the world. Every single Gros Michel banana tree and every banana farm around the world were clones of clones of clones, which meant at one point there was one Gros Michel tree. It made really good bananas, and so we started cloning it. We'd take pieces of wood off the tree, we'd put it in water so it would grow roots, we'd plant them, and we'd ship them around the world. Well, that's good. If you're a farmer hoping that every single tree produces really good fruit for you to sell at market, that's a great thing. But here's the problem. Because there was no genetic diversity, in the 1950s, a fungus developed in Panama. And this fungus had the ability to grow on the banana trees and kill them in just a couple of seasons. So if a fungus can kill a banana tree in Panama, what else can it do? Kill them all, right? Every banana tree in the world was equally susceptible to the fungus because there was no variety, there was no genetic variety. Natural selection couldn't help the banana trees. It couldn't help some to survive while others died because they were all genetically identical. And very quickly, in just a couple of seasons, the entire worldwide crop of banana trees is wiped out. They go extinct. So this was an emergency. There are some places in the world where bananas are a staple part of your diet. If you don't have bananas, you're going to be, you might not starve to death, but you might go hungry for a while. And so scientists knew we had to fix this problem. We needed a different banana tree. So what do? They find a species of banana called Cavendish. Cavendish is what you eat now. That's a Cavendish banana. They find a really good tree, and because they were in a hurry, they clone it. They clone hundreds of thousands of this one tree. They ship them around the world. They grow these banana trees, and now we've got plentiful bananas coming from these Cavendish trees. It solved the problem temporarily, but in January of 2016, we discovered a new fungus that's attacking the Cavendish. And since they're genetically identical, what's going to happen to our banana trees? They're getting wiped out, right? They're going away. Our Cavendish banana trees are going away. There's no way to stop it. So if you're a banana lover, it's very possible that the banana that you enjoy now is going to be gone. It won't be a part of your diet in the future. Maybe, right? Maybe. So scientists think they might have a solution to this. One possible thing we could do is genetically modify future banana trees so they would be resistant. So basically we take a currently living Cavendish that hasn't been destroyed yet. We clone it, and we genetically modify the clones so that they're resistant to this fungus, and then plant them and maybe have bananas in the future. So that's one option. Another option is maybe we find another species of banana. And a couple years ago when I did this presentation, Mrs. Lumen saw an article and sent it to me. There's another banana species has potential to replace the Cavendish, and it's this guy. So those are funky looking bananas. They have a blue tint to them. They're called blue Java bananas. And the really cool thing about their flesh is that instead of tasting like a traditional banana, they taste like what, Mrs. Lumen? Vanilla milkshakes, right? Ice cream flavored banana, which would be kind of cool. That's a great question. I mean, it's plant-based, so it will probably be similar. Its flesh will probably be similar. It maybe is a little more sugary if it has a sweet flavor. The Gros Michel was a little more sugary, so this would probably be a little sugary. Pretty close. Yeah, good question.
So, when you said that they like found the Cavendish and now they're, like, are these being grown? Like, was it something that they had created, or
Right.
are they just?
So in the wild, in rainforest and whatnot, there are other species of banana trees that grow. Not in huge fields like we cultivate them, but they grow. And so if we take those from the wild, sometimes we can hybridize them with other banana species to get better flavor. That's what's happened with Cavendish. We actually hybridize it with another tree to get a really good banana. So is it possible that we can create a new banana that's like a hybridization of Cavendish and blue Java? Yeah, probably. And they may be doing that, I'm not sure.
How do they do that? Like, how would you?
Well, trees are actually really easy to hybridize. This is going to sound too simple, but you basically take a piece of wood from one tree, like a piece of branch from another, and you actually just kind of tape them together and let them root, and sometimes they will actually grow together and share genes, and you get a hybridized plant. Animals, it's not nearly that easy. Most animals can't be hybridized.
So I could buy like one of those things, take the stem off it, tape it to a regular banana and grow my own different banana tree.
I mean, maybe, yeah. It's not a guarantee that they'll hybridize. Instead, just my two trees growing side by side. But if you do it a whole bunch of times, right, you replicate that, yeah, sometimes those plants fuse together and share their genes. Yep. If you do that, bring a banana back someday for us to try.
I'll try them.
You bring in that banana and Miss Luna will bring a Chickosaurus and we'll just have a real party. Now, assuming there is variation in populations, natural selection can work. We get adaptation. We get living things developing adaptations to make them a better fit for their environment. So for example, as a human, you have a bunch of adaptations you've developed. Can you think of one that makes you a good fit for survival? How is that helpful for survival? Yeah, so some animals have more webbing than we do. If an animal spends more time in the water, they have more webbing. Think of a dog, slightly more webbing than us. For helping them swim in the water, think of a duck, a lot more webbing than we do. Cool. Yes? Opposable thumb is a really important one for primates. So once we became primates and we were able to stand up and face one another, one thing that developed as a result of that was increased aggression and the tendency to fight. And so having an opposable thumb helps you to defend yourself, it helps you to clasp a weapon, it helps you to climb to get away, right, the fight or flight response. It helps you to build tools, it helps you to build shelter, build defense. And so the opposable thumb is really important adaptation for human survival. Cool. I want to talk about an adaptation that tells a story about all of us. So this is a story of unity, a story of our shared history. However, it gets misconstrued as a story of division and hate. And this is a story of skin color. So if you think about the history of our world, we know there's been a lot of hatred and violence and war problems associated with skin color. But if everybody knew why we have different skin colors, I think that it would be really a story of unity and a story that would bring us as humans together. So let's talk about that. Currently in 2020, we have a huge palette of beautiful skin colors in the world, ranging from very pale to very dark skin. But if we go back hundreds of thousands of years to the earliest humans, that story is going to start right here in Central Africa. So the early humans We couldn't see their skin. Their entire skin was covered in a thick layer of hair, which we might call fur. So here's a picture of what early humans might have looked like. Evidence suggests that that's a pretty good representation of the earliest humans, covered in fur. Now picture this for a moment. You're living near the equator in Africa. Your entire body is covered in a thick layer of fur. What's a challenge that you have to deal with? Right? Heat. Overheating can actually be stressful on the body. If you're chronically overheated, your body tends to develop disease quicker. Your immune system is weaker. And so we had all early humans being overheated, leading to shorter lives, very disease-filled short lives. So occasionally, an early baby human would be born with a genetic mutation that gave them slightly less hair, slightly less fur on the body. And if that happened, that baby instantly had a better chance of survival. It was a better fit for survival, and so it had a chance to grow up and reproduce, and the next generation might be a little less furry. And over many generations, all or most of that fur leaves the human body. Is there still hair in the human body? Sure. Some more in some places, some more on some people than others. However, for the most part, we are mostly covered in skin versus fur. Now check this out. Underneath that dark fur was skin that had no pigmentation. So every single one of us has an ancestor in Central Africa that had skin that was pale. Not white skin. White skin has some pigmentation. Very pale, almost transparent skin. Problem. If you have skin with no pigmentation and you're living under the direct rays of the sun, now what challenge are you dealing with? What's that? Sunburn instantly, and then following sunburn would be cancer, right? Skin cancer. So we had huge numbers of early humans dying of skin cancers. They didn't know it was skin cancer. Something horrible was happening. People were dying really young. And so any babies who were born with a little bit of pigmentation instantly had a survival advantage. Less of a chance of getting cancer, more likely they live, grow up, reproduce, and make babies who also have a little pigmentation. So now we fast forward a few more thousand generations, and all early humans have developed very, very dark skin with lots of pigmentation. So we have ancestors, we all have ancestors with really light skin, we all have ancestors with very dark skin. And that works really well, if we go back to the map. That works really well for early humans living in the central part of Africa. They got rid of the fur, they have the dark skin, they're protected from the sun, perfect. But we don't stay in Africa. Some groups stay there and colonize the entire continent. Some groups of humans leave Africa, head up to Europe, some head over to Asia. Now those groups that head north run into a new problem. When they get to the northern part of Europe and the northern part of Asia, the sun's not a problem anymore. The sun's angles aren't nearly as severe. They don't need that dark skin. So there's no longer natural selection pushing them to have darker skin. However, the soil quality is very bad, and their food quality is pretty crappy. And so a lot of people are malnourished, they don't have the appropriate vitamins they need to stay healthy. And here's the cool thing about your body. Humans have the ability to produce their own vitamins at the cellular level if they're in the presence of sunlight. So if sun can penetrate into your cells, you can make some of the vitamins that might be missing from your diet. So suddenly, natural selection is pushing humans to have lighter skin in those parts of Europe and Asia where food supply is bad and sunlight's not a big problem. So now over the next several thousand years, we developed what we call light, white, or Caucasian skin. So both skin colors were just useful for survival. I say both, I realize it's not both, but both extremes of skin color were for survival. And then something else happened. Humans domesticated ourselves. We figured out how to make clothing and hats and shelter, and eventually we invent sunscreen, right? So we're no longer depending on our skin color to protect us from the sun or to allow sun to provide nutrients for us. And so natural selection of skin color kind of stops. But what happens next? We start to develop transportation that allows us to move very easily around the world. We begin to mate with people from all parts of the world, and we mix these shades together to develop this palette that we see today. So why do we have different skin colors? It's because we survived together as humans. That's the only reason that we have a variety of skin color. And so that's the story of unity, right? And I think that's a great story about our common ancestry, and it'll be something that will be great for everyone to know. All right, so this class is called Survival of the Fittest. Darwin didn't actually use that phrase, survival of the fittest, in his book. However, the basic idea is in there. Let's look at this quote from Darwin. It is not the strongest species that survive. So survival isn't about being strong. Of course, as an individual, like if you're strong and you get attacked by a lion, maybe you have a better chance of survival. But as a whole group, it's not the strongest organisms that live. It's not the most intelligent that survive. It's those that are most responsive to change. Those species that have the ability to continue to change as the world around them changes are the ones that get to survive. All right, so I've talked to you now for about 40 minutes about evolution, about Charles Darwin's theory. I think we kind of have a good handle on the theory. I want you to leave here today, though, not just hearing about evolution, I want you to actually see it with your own eyes. Unfortunately, I can't show you human evolution. Human evolution takes tens of thousands of years for a small change. And so we'll never be able to observe it. We have to depend on the fossil record and on genetic testing and science to tell us how humans have evolved. But if we can look at a species that reproduces very quickly, if we can have several generations in a couple hours, we could probably see evolution happening. And so a great species to study is bacteria, some species of bacteria. On the board here, I have a picture of a petri dish filled with E. coli. E. coli is a small bacteria. Once you get thousands of it together, it looks like green slime. So those white discs are actually antibiotic discs. Right around them, there's no bacteria living there. But in between the discs, you see that green slime. That's the bacteria we're talking about. All right, so I want you to imagine for a moment, if we were to pluck one piece of bacteria off of your body, because you're covered in it, you actually have more bacteria living on your body than cells in the human body. It's a good thing. It helps keep you healthy. It eats debris that lands in the body. It helps eat funguses that try to grow in your body. But anyways, if we take one of those bacteria off of your skin and we give it unlimited food, it will live for about 20 minutes. And after 20 minutes, it will have lived its whole life and it'll tear apart into 2 baby bacteria. And then those 2 baby bacteria will live for about 20 minutes and then tear apart into 2 more baby bacteria. So let's math this out a little bit. Start at time 0. Let's say it is 12:35. So let's say at 12:35 and 20 seconds, we get 2 bacteria. And then 4. And then, not 20 minutes, I'm sorry. 20 minutes later, we have 4. And 20 minutes later, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1,000, et cetera, right? They start to double the numbers very quickly. If we let that process play out for 24 hours, so we come back here tomorrow, and those bacteria were given unlimited food supplies. Now, if you're in my class, you can't answer this because I think we talked about this. Any guesses for how much space that bacteria is going to take up? What kind of a container might we be able to fill, or how much area might we be able to cover with all the bacteria that would grow in 24 hours from one parent bacteria? Any guesses? Just throw out a guess. Doesn't matter if it's wrong. What's that? An ocean. So he's guessing that the entire ocean is going to be filled with bacteria. From one little bacteria on your skin. That seems like a massive amount of bacteria. But you know what? His guess is actually too small. Bigger than an ocean. What's that? Well, you can't see one bacteria, but you can see thousands of them clumped together.
Continuously multiplying.
Right.
How much then can we see?
Oh, good question. So they brush off and they become dust and float away from us. If they never brushed off, if they just accumulated there, yeah, you become like slime. You'd be covered in slime. Yeah. So bigger than the ocean is actually the surface of the entire planet. One bacteria, if given unlimited food, can produce enough descendant bacteria to cover the entire planet in a layer about 6 feet deep in 24 hours. So these things reproduce very, very quickly. Now, they don't do that because they run out of food. But here's what we're going to see in this video. A group of scientists at Harvard said, can we visualize bacteria evolution since we know that it reproduces very quickly? They thought, what if we set up a giant petri dish and give bacteria lots of nutrients so they can reproduce in large numbers, so they become visible. And what if we give them some areas that they could grow into, but areas that should be lethal to them? What if we make a part of the petri dish that has like a little bit of antibiotic that should kill them off? Can they adapt to that environment? Can they survive? And then what if we give them another area of the petri dish that has like 10 times the lethal dose of antibiotic? And another part of the petri dish that has 100 times the lethal dose of antibiotic? Can these E. coli not only adapt, but survive those conditions? And here are the results. You can actually see what they saw in this experiment at Harvard. So the white cloudy stuff you see, that's the bacteria.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
We'll go back to that last image.
That bacteria mutate, which are normally antibiotic.
Okay. So these colorful lines are showing the evolutionary history of those bacteria. They've actually changed. This would be like the timeline here. From here to here would be like you and your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-grandparents, right? But we're looking at way more generations of bacteria than that over these 11 days. Notice how the original species of bacteria is having descendants that have evolved, adapted, and become new types of life. So if we took this original species and we tried to put it here with its great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, it would just die instantly. It doesn't have the same adaptations that those descendants have. So this is a great visualization of evolution. Now this should also be a terrifying video. If you think about this in terms of the human body, this video is really scary. Because we did this exact experiment in real humans over the last number of decades. So let's go back to like when our grandparents or great-grandparents were young. The humans first invented antibiotics. So somebody gets a bacterial infection, they go to the doctor, they get an antibiotic, the antibiotic kills off the bacteria, and we're fine. What happens over time? If we have lots of humans filling themselves with antibiotics, how do the bacteria respond to that? How do they respond in the video? They evolve, right? You have, occasionally you have a bacteria born that has the ability to survive that antibiotic. And if it survives, it grows up and it reproduces, right? Reproduces. And so you get more bacteria that are resistant to that first antibiotic. Now, the first antibiotic we created was penicillin. And eventually, most bacteria become resistant to penicillin. So as a response, the scientific community tries to find a new antibiotic. And we create a new one. And then we send that out to pharmaceutical companies, and they send it to doctors. People are being treated with new antibiotics. And that works for a little while until the bacteria become resistant. And so we create a new antibiotic, and we create a new antibiotic. And over many decades, we actually have forced the evolution. We've sped up the evolution of bacteria that attack human bodies to become resistant to all antibiotics that we know how to produce. There are some bacteria on this earth that can survive our strongest antibiotics. We call them superbugs, and they're terrifying. If a person gets infected with a superbug, there's no medicine we can give to help them battle that infection. Now, if they're a healthy human, if they're your age or early adults and have a strong immune system, they probably will be sick for a while but can battle off the infection. But if they're a kid who has a weak immune system, or a teenager who has cancer, or a 35-year-old who has AIDS, or an elderly person whose immune system is weakening, they're not going to be able to battle it, and we don't have any medicine we can give them. So unfortunately, there are people that die from these superbugs. There's nothing we can do about it because of the evolution of bacteria. So this isn't a surprise to doctors. Like if you ask your doctor about this, they know about this, and they've tried to improve their practices over the last 20, 30 years. They don't prescribe antibiotics as much. They try to only give them, they're supposed to only give them as a last resort because we don't want to keep creating this condition where we're pushing bacteria to become evolved and adapted to being able to survive antibiotics. That's a scary world. And will more bacteria continue to become resistant over time? Sure. Will we be able to make stronger antibiotics? Maybe. Yeah, maybe. But it's this back and forth battle that we're going to have forever. So I want to end with a couple of things here. Another cool example of evolution I'd like to share, and then we're going to talk about human evolution and the future of human evolution just to wrap up. Before we get to that though, if you have a pet dog, how many people have or have ever had a pet dog? So your dogs are great examples of evolution that we can observe, but it's a type of fake evolution or artificial evolution. And it goes a little bit like this. Every single species of dog you can imagine, every breed of dog, they're obviously not all pictured here, can trace their family lineage back to the gray wolf. In fact, every dog that you've ever seen on Earth is a descendant of one of 3 gray wolves. Not 3 types of wolves, 3 individual wolves in Siberia. So how do we end up having these 3 wolves in Siberia become dogs? Well, we kind of sped up the natural selection process in an artificial way. Early humans made friends with these 3 wolves by giving them food. And by sharing food with them, the wolves were not aggressive toward the humans. And so they developed a bond. When these wolves reproduced, when humans basically were breeding these wolves, they got a whole litter of pups, and they decided to only breed pups that were super friendly. So wolves, I mean, there's only so much friendliness a wolf has, right? But the ones that seemed a little less aggressive towards humans, those are the ones that reproduce. They were basically making natural selection happen, but it wasn't nature, it was humans doing so. And after many generations of doing that, they created the dog, and we continue to do this to this day. Breeders still choose traits that they want to see in the dog, and they'll breed for those traits. And so we're still kind of inventing new things, new types of dogs. It's the exact same process of evolution that happens in the natural world. We call it artificial selection, but dogs are a great example of how living things can and do change with time. Okay, so let's talk about humans. Charles Darwin doesn't talk about human evolution in his first book for a couple of reasons. One, remember he had to rush to get it out the door. He hadn't fully mapped out what he wanted to say about human evolution. Also, he knew that human evolution was going to be even more controversial of a topic than just evolution in general. So he cycles back to this, and in 1871, he publishes a book that focuses on evolution of humans. The book's called The Descent of Man. Obviously, by man, he's referencing humans. And so we can kind of summarize his thoughts in that book with this one key sentence. He says, we must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that humans, with all of our noble qualities, so the way that we think we rule the world, with our use of technology, right, with our kind of ability to control, manipulate the planet, with all those qualities, we still bear in our bodily frame, so in our cells, in our organs, in our tissues, we still have stamped upon us our lowly origin. What is Darwin saying here? He's saying that we like to think of ourselves as special. However, from a biological perspective, we're built out of the same kind of cells, we're coded for by the same DNA, we're powered by the same mitochondria as all other types of life on Earth. So why then do we not follow the same laws of evolution and Charles Darwin says we do. He says that humans are just a modified descendant of an earlier version, and we can trace our family tree all the way back to where we fit into the same tree as the rest of the type of life. Now, Darwin didn't have significant evidence for this other than his idea that it makes sense that humans would do this and a little bit of fossil record. But in 1950, once we discovered DNA, and in 1990, once we start mapping human DNA, and in 2003, once we finish mapping all of the genes in the human body, we start to see some really strong evidence for Darwin's ideas over 100 years later. According to the theory of evolution, humans and chimpanzees should be pretty closely related. Well, what does our DNA say? We share 98% of our genes with chimpanzees. 98% of the coding for building you is the same coding used for building a chimpanzee. All right, what about a mouse? Obviously, a mouse is more human-like than something like a flower. Well, mice share 92% of their DNA with humans. All the way back, we can go all the way back to plants, which are so very different than animals, and we still see an 18% match. 18% of the genes that code for making a plant match the genes that code for you. So this is pretty fascinating. This suggests that, living things do have common ancestry with other types of life on Earth, and all the principles of natural selection and survival that apply to the animals that Darwin studied apply to us. Now, this is where you come in, especially those of you that maybe are thinking about going into the sciences. There is a brand new field of biology opening up. By brand new, I mean like maybe 15, 20 years old, so not super new, but new in terms of biology. Before, like the 1990s, when we really started to understand DNA, we just kind of thought that you get your information, your genetic information from sperm and egg. And that's all there was to it. Sperm gave you half your instructions, egg gave you half your instructions, boom, and then you just follow those directions to build your body and live your life. Everything was determined by instructions. Why do you have blue eyes? Because you got those genes from your parents. Why do you have curly hair? Because you got those genes from your parents. We still believe that, right? All evidence suggests that that's still how genes are passed from one generation to the next. But we're learning that there's a little more complexity to it. We're learning that if we want to think about the future of human life and the future evolution of humans, we need to understand that there's more to how we grow and how we're built than just the genes that we inherit. And here's how it works. We think that, and we use the word think a lot. This is still kind of new. We're still figuring this out. We think that once you receive your genes, that as you start reading those genes and determining how to build your body throughout your life, that your genes get stamped with chemicals that are a reflection of your environment. So for example, if a baby is exposed to physical abuse, horrible thing, we think not only is there possible emotional trauma associated with physical abuse, and probably maybe physical injury, we think the DNA of the baby actually gets stamped with a chemical message that determines how they read their genes for the rest of their life, and possibly they pass that information to the next generation and the next generation. In fact, we believe that so much that we've put together a measurement scale that determines a score that we could give a child based on their life experiences that might predict their future diseases. And so the score looks at something like, was this child physically or sexually abused? When they were maybe 4 or 5 years old, did their parents get divorced? Did their house burn down? Were they, maybe because of poverty, did they not have access to food, so they were in starvation mode? If we start looking at all those environmental factors, we find a really strong correlation to diseases later in life. And so what is the future of medicine? The future of medicine might be saying, okay, not only are we going to treat people when they're sick, but let's take a look and predict what diseases they might have based on things that happened to them when they were kids, and also be aware that future generations might be affected by things that happen to people living now. Will that affect how humans continue to change over time? Sure. And maybe we can have positive change if we understand how these things are affecting life. Here's an example Mrs. Lumen likes. We also, in this field of epigenetics, started to dig back into historical records. We started looking at, some European countries have really detailed records of family health that go back many generations, and some researchers found a trend. They found that when kids, all the way up to the age of like 12 or 13, had access to plenty of food and maybe experienced childhood obesity, those kids would grow up have grandchildren and great-grandchildren that also were obese. But if a child had a healthy body weight and access to normal amounts of food when they were before 13 years old, we find that their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, especially grandsons and great-grandsons, did not struggle with obesity. And this wasn't being attributed to just, this family isn't good with food, doesn't make good food choices, so each generation makes bad food choices. Sure, that happens. But this study was just looking at, is there something that happens to your DNA that stamps your DNA permanently if you're obese as a child? We think that's the case. And the thing about it is, all of you are past the age already where your DNA has been stamped with environmental decisions that you've been making. And not just related to obesity, related to cigarette smoking and vaping, right? Vaping is very new. We don't know how it's stamping the DNA yet, but we think that it is. And so we just have to be careful with the decisions that we make, realizing that humans are tied together in this long story from the early human evolution to future generations by the DNA we pass on, and this DNA can be manipulated in ways we don't even know about. Okay, last thing I want to talk about before we open up for questions. So if humans evolve, and if we are continuing to evolve in the future, what are some ways that we might see humans change? I'm going to talk about surviving car crashes. Can you think of other things, maybe in the last 100 years, that humans have experienced that we never experienced before, but that future humans might have a way to deal with them because of evolution? So cars are a great example, because before 100 years ago, people would have died from car crashes because we didn't ride around in cars. Can you think of anything else that we weren't exposed to until the last 150, whatever years? Yeah, sitting an awful lot more, right? Sedentary creatures. So what might the future evolution of the human body look like because we sit a lot more? Maybe the structure of our neck and our back, right? Because not only do we sit, but we hunch a lot more, right? We look at phones. That's your one.
Too, because of holding cell phones, the pinkies are being bent out more.
Right, yeah. So the fact that a lot of people that hold their phone do this thumb on the side, pinky underneath, 3 fingers behind, will that change the structure of the human body? Now the thing about that is, something like that's affecting the body after we've already made our sex cells doesn't necessarily get passed on. So you can't pass on traits that you develop in life. But long term, if many people are doing this, does there become an advantage to holding your phone like that increases your survival? Are you more likely to survive in the future if you're better at holding your phone? I mean, I can't see it now, but is it possible in the future? Maybe. You were going to say something.
I was just wondering if all the headbangers of the 90s, if their children were born with, more, like their necks or...
Right, yeah. Right. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah. Especially if their DNA was being stamped.
Right.
What about the depression and stuff?
What's that?
Depression and stuff like social media. Is that
It can be, yeah. So going back to what we talked about with epigenetics, yeah, depression definitely having an impact on the DNA getting passed to another generation. So as we increase our use of social media, we know studies say that people tend to be unhappier or experience more depression because of the side effects of spending time on social media and comparing yourself to other people. Do we see the effects of that showing up in several generations? Yeah, that's a good one. So this clip talks about not necessarily what's definitely going to happen to humans, but what would have to happen to humans via evolution if we were going to survive car crashes. And you're going to meet a fine-looking fellow named Graham in this video clip. There he is. Enjoy.
The astonishing progress we've seen in car safety technology, driving is still, inarguably, a dangerous feat. So what would happen if instead of evolving our cars to be safer, we evolved ourselves? In 2015, U.S. auto manufacturers sold 17.5 million cars and light trucks, smashing a 15-year-old record. And there's no question that cars are becoming increasingly sophisticated. But humans aren't evolving as fast as the cars we create, and our bodies aren't physically capable of withstanding the forces we encounter in in car accidents. According to the NHTSA, over the course of 2014, there were 32,674 accident-related fatalities in the U.S. alone. But what if we could evolve past our current state? What would we look like if our species adapted specifically to the rigors of automobiles? Meet Graham. Graham is the result of a collaboration between artist Patricia Piccinini, trauma surgeon Christian Kinfield, and collision expert David Logan. Their team asked what humans would look like if we were built to survive on the roads. The differences between Graham and the average person are striking, to say the least. First, his skull is much larger than average. Our brains float in cerebrospinal fluid surrounded by a skull designed to fracture and spread the force of an impact. Graham's brain is the same as ours, but it's encased in a better helmet. It's surrounded by more fluid, and his skull has, essentially, crumple zones, allowing him to survive a much stronger impact than you or I could. Second, Graham's face is super flat and covered with fatty tissue to protect his nose, his sinuses, and his ears from steering wheels, dashboards, and breaking glass. Third, the neck, or rather the lack thereof. Since the neck is one of the most vulnerable points of the body in a crash and incapable of preventing the head from jolting forward, Graham has none. He has no neck. His ribs just go all the way up to the skull. Let's follow those neck ribs down to his rib cage. It's filled with organic airbags, which excrete a fluid upon impact, providing much more protection than our conventional musculoskeletal structure. These provide an opportunity for a more gradual stop during the forward momentum of an accident. Graham's skin is also thicker and tougher to reduce the likelihood of abrasions. Finally, and honestly, this is probably the coolest part, Graham has an extra joint in his feet, allowing him to execute a super jump when he needs to GTFO out of Dodge. You know, like a grasshopper or like the Hulk in the Marvel movies. Before I get too carried away with this, we should point out that Graham is not a living being, and there are, at this point, no plans to make him one. Instead, Patricia and her team intend Graham to be a catalyst for conversation. He's an educational tool meant to emphasize the importance of safety systems and to remind us how vulnerable we all actually are. And there's another question here. Would you trade bodies with Graham? What sort of evolutionary perks would you take given the chance? I'd love to breathe underwater, for example, but I'll admit the spring-loaded jump thing is pretty cool. Anyhow, thanks for watching. Go ahead and subscribe while you still have fingers that can click things, and visit us for more of the weirdest, newest tech and science over at now.howstuffworks.com.
So, survival of the fittest, the idea that survival comes from a variety. There's variation in the population, there's a better chance the whole species survives. And the more adaptations that a species can develop, the more likely they are to survive long term. So we have a little bit of time here before the bell. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask about, anything from the presentation or other questions that you might have. The evolution of corn? Yeah. Just another example of evolution would be the food that we eat. Remember I said the dogs were an artificial version of evolution where humans kind of forced dogs to change? We've done the same kind of things to our food. If we go back about 200 years, sweet corn that we get in the grocery store or grow in our gardens didn't exist. Instead, there was a plant in Mexico called teosinte. Teosinte was basically a weed that had a stalk that grew on the top with a very hard, crunchy shell. And if you were to use a rock to break the hard, crunchy shell open, there were little crunchy kernels inside. And if you use a rock to break those kernels open, there was a little bit of starch. And so, folks that lived in Mexico a couple hundred years ago would grind those up, extract the starch, which is cornstarch, we call it corn yet, and use it as a nutrient. Well, they figured out that when they started to grow and harvest the teosinte, occasionally a plant would grow that had a softer shell. It was a little easier to crush open. So they thought, well, what if I only breed this plant? What if we let all the other teosinte die and we just breed this plant? So kind of like natural selection, right? It's a human thing. And so they did that. Those of you in my AP Bio class, I think you watched a video about this And so after a while, they got rid of that outer shell. We developed a species that didn't have the outer shell. We just had the kernels, which had their own crunchy shell. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is looking for offspring plant, baby plants that didn't have a crunchy shell in the kernel. And as we would find them, we would breed them and let all the other teosinte die. Eventually, what did we create? Modern corn. We changed the name from teosinte to maize and then to corn, but it's really just a plant, a weed that we as humans forced its evolution to change it. Yes?
What do you think like the next big food change would be, like genetically?
Yeah, so the next big food change,